In the last 48 hours, a weapons deployment occurred that fundamentally alters the strategic balance in the Middle East in ways that no amount of American military aid can reverse. And the Israeli defense establishment is currently in emergency session trying to process implications that have no comfortable resolution. 6 Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers landed at Isfahan Air Base in central Iran on Thursday morning. These are not symbolic deployments or temporary exercises. These aircraft carried full combat loads, including Kh-47 Me-2 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, and Russian ground crews are establishing permanent maintenance facilities that intelligence assessments suggest will support sustained operations for a minimum of 18 to 36 months. The Israeli Air Force responded within 12 hours by grounding its entire F-35 fleet indefinitely and implementing airspace restrictions that have effectively sealed Israeli skies to anything except essential defensive patrols. That response tells you everything you need to know about how seriously Israeli military planners are taking this development, because the F-35 represents the cornerstone of Israeli air superiority doctrine, and grounding that fleet means acknowledging that the fundamental assumptions governing Israeli defense strategy just became obsolete. What happened in the last 2 days represents the most consequential shift in regional military balance since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and unlike that crisis which Israel survived through mobilization and American resupply, this situation has no military solution that Israeli planners can identify within acceptable cost parameters. I am going to take you inside every dimension of what just occurred. How did Russia execute this deployment without triggering the interdiction response that Israel has maintained against Iranian military development for 2 decades? What does the presence of Tu-160 bombers armed with hypersonic missiles mean for Israeli air superiority and the broader freedom of operation that has defined Israeli military doctrine since 1967? And what happens to regional stability when the country that has served as America's primary Middle East proxy since 1948 suddenly faces an adversary equipped with weapon systems that its defenses cannot counter? There are no easy answers to these questions, but understanding the strategic reality is essential for grasping what comes next in a region that just experienced a fundamental power shift. 3 questions will drive everything that follows, and by the end of this analysis, you will understand why we are watching Israeli military dominance encounter its first genuine existential challenge in modern history. Section 1, the deployment operation. Let me start with the question that is dominating discussions in Tel Aviv right now. How did Russia deploy 6 strategic bombers to Iran without Israeli or American interdiction? The answer reveals something critical about the limits of air defense systems when confronting adversaries who understand your detection capabilities and are willing to accept temporary vulnerability to achieve strategic positioning. The Tu-160 is the largest and heaviest combat aircraft ever built. This is not a small tactical bomber that can evade radar detection. It has a wingspan of 55 meters, a length of 54 meters, and a maximum takeoff weight of 275 metric tons. When 6 of these aircraft fly in formation, they create a radar signature visible from 300 kilometers away. Russia did not attempt to hide this deployment. They executed it in broad daylight with full awareness that Israeli and American intelligence would track every kilometer of the flight path from Russian airspace through Iranian airspace to Isfahan Air Base. The bombers departed from Engels Air Base in Saratov Oblast at 03:20 Moscow time on Thursday morning. They flew south through Russian airspace, crossed into Iranian airspace over the Caspian Sea at 06:15 and landed at Isfahan by 08:40 local time. Total flight time was approximately 5 hours and 20 minutes, covering 4,200 kilometers. Israeli air defense tracked the entire flight. American satellites monitored the deployment in real time. Turkish radar systems observed the aircraft crossing from the Caspian into Iranian territory. Every relevant intelligence service knew exactly what was happening as it happened, and nobody stopped it. Let me explain why that non-response is more significant than the deployment itself. Israel has conducted hundreds of airstrikes against Iranian weapons facilities, convoys transporting advanced weapons to Hezbollah, and personnel associated with Iranian military programs in Syria over the past decade. The entire operational doctrine has been predicated on maintaining escalation dominance, the ability to strike Iranian assets with impunity because Iran lacks the capability to impose costs that Israel finds unacceptable. That doctrine just collapsed. Intercepting 6 Tu-160 bombers in flight would require engaging Russian military aircraft with air-to-air missiles, shooting down Russian pilots, and potentially triggering direct military confrontation with a nuclear-armed power that has explicitly stated it considers its deployed forces in allied countries to be under the protection of Russian nuclear doctrine. Israel can bomb Iranian facilities operated by Iranians without triggering World War III. Israel cannot bomb Russian facilities operated by Russians without crossing a threshold that no Israeli leadership is willing to cross, regardless of the strategic stakes involved. Russia knows this. Iran knows this, and they structured the deployment specifically to exploit this asymmetry. The presence of Russian personnel operating Russian equipment from Iranian territory creates an escalation firebreak that protects Iranian military infrastructure from Israeli strikes more effectively than any air defense system Iran could deploy independently. If Israel bombs the Isfahan base where Tu-160s are stationed, they are bombing Russian military personnel and Russian strategic assets, which represents an act of war against Russia itself. This is what strategic analysts call tripwire deployment, positioning forces not because they are militarily necessary in that specific location, but because their presence creates political constraints on adversary action that achieves strategic objectives without firing a shot. But the tripwire function is only part of what this deployment accomplishes. The real strategic impact comes from the weapon systems these bombers carry and what those systems mean for Israeli operational freedom. Each Tu-160 can carry 12 Kh-47 Anu-2 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. The Kinzhal has a range of 2,000 kilometers, travels at Mach 10 to Mach 12 during terminal approach, and carries either conventional or nuclear warheads with yields up to 500 kilotons. Let me explain what those specifications mean in operational terms. From Isfahan Air Base, Kinzhal missiles can reach any target in Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, or Turkey within 6 to 8 minutes of launch. The hypersonic velocity during terminal phase means the missiles descend at speeds exceeding 12,000 kilometers per hour, creating kinetic energy that makes them catastrophically destructive even with conventional warheads. More critically, there is no existing air defense system that can reliably intercept hypersonic missiles traveling at Mach 10 plus velocities. American Patriot systems, Israeli Arrow interceptors, and the Iron Dome all rely on calculating missile trajectories and positioning interceptors in the predicted flight path. That works against ballistic missiles following predictable parabolic arcs or cruise missiles flying at subsonic speeds. It does not work against hypersonic missiles that can maneuver during flight and whose speed compresses decision timelines to the point where human operators cannot respond. And automated systems lack sufficient processing time to calculate intercept solutions. The Israeli Air Force grounded its F-35 fleet because those aircraft are designed to operate in permissive or contested environments where air superiority can be established through a combination of stealth, electronic warfare, and supporting assets. They are not designed to operate in environments where taking off from an airbase triggers immediate hypersonic missile strikes that can destroy the runway and aircraft shelters before planes can get airborne. Israeli air bases are small, concentrated, and well-known. Israel has approximately 8 major air bases that host combat aircraft. Russia now has weapon systems stationed 900 kilometers away that can destroy any of those bases within 6 to 8 minutes of receiving launch authorization, and Israel has no defense against those weapons. This is the strategic reality that forced the F-35 grounding. Israeli military planners are not confident they can operate offensive air missions without losing substantial portions of their air fleet to hypersonic strikes targeting the bases themselves rather than the aircraft in flight. The numbers here are important to understand. Israel has approximately 36 F-35I aircraft in active service, representing an investment of roughly $5 billion and a decade of integration work. Losing even 6 to 8 aircraft in a single strike sequence would represent catastrophic material and psychological damage that would take years to replace. Russia has deployed 72 Kinzhal missiles to Iran based on current intelligence assessments, 6 bombers carrying 12 missiles each. That is sufficient to target every Israeli airbase simultaneously with multiple missiles per target to ensure mission success, even if some missiles fail or are intercepted by lucky shots. The asymmetry here is total. Russia can destroy Israel's air force on the ground faster than Israel can get aircraft into the air. And there is nothing Israel can do to change that equation without either developing hypersonic defense systems that do not currently exist or eliminating the Russian bomber presence, which would trigger World War III. So, this is what strategic checkmate looks like in modern warfare. And it was accomplished through a deployment operation that took 5 hours and 20 minutes. Section 2. The collapse of Israeli air superiority. Now that we understand how the deployment occurred, we need to examine what it means for the regional military balance that has defined Middle Eastern security architecture since 1967. Israeli military doctrine has rested on one foundational principle for 57 years: absolute air superiority. Every war Israel has fought, every strike operation it has conducted, every strategic plan it has developed has assumed that Israeli aircraft can operate freely in regional airspace while adversary air forces are suppressed or destroyed. The 1967 Six-Day War began with Operation Focus, a preemptive strike that destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground in the first 3 hours of combat. That air superiority allowed Israeli ground forces to advance rapidly without facing meaningful air attack, winning the war in 6 days. The 1973 Yom Kippur War nearly ended in Israeli defeat when initial Arab attacks achieved surprise and Israeli air forces suffered heavy losses to Soviet-supplied air defense systems. Israel survived by rapidly adapting tactics, receiving massive American resupply of aircraft and munitions, and ultimately re-establishing air superiority that allowed counteroffensives. The 1982 Lebanon War showcased Israeli air superiority when the Israeli Air Force destroyed 90 Syrian aircraft without losing a single plane in air-to-air combat. That dominance demonstrated technological and tactical superiority that became the foundation of Israeli deterrence. Every Israeli strike on Iranian facilities in Syria over the past decade has been possible only because Israeli aircraft could penetrate Syrian airspace, deliver weapons, and return home without facing threats they could not manage. The Syrian Air Force has been irrelevant, and Syrian air defenses have been suppressed through electronic warfare and targeted strikes. That entire operational model just became inoperable. Let me walk you through what happens if Israel attempts to conduct strike operations under current conditions. Israeli F-35s take off from Nevatim or Ramon air bases to conduct strikes against Iranian facilities in Syria. Russian surveillance satellites and ground-based radar systems detect the launches within seconds. Russian liaison officers at Isfahan Air Base receive real-time intelligence about Israeli aircraft departures. Russian commanders now face a decision. They can allow Israeli aircraft to proceed to Syria and conduct strikes against Iranian assets, or they can interpret those aircraft departures as preparation for strikes against the Isfahan base itself and authorize preemptive hypersonic missile launches to destroy Israeli air bases before aircraft can return. This is called use it or lose it logic, and it creates catastrophic instability. If Russia believes Israeli aircraft taking off might be headed to strike Russian assets, they have incentive to launch immediately rather than wait for confirmation. But launching creates the exact escalation both sides supposedly want to avoid. Israeli planners understand this dynamic, which is why the F-35 fleet is grounded. Every combat sortie now carries the risk of triggering hypersonic strikes on Israeli air bases, and that risk is unacceptable given the potential for losing the entire air fleet in the opening minutes of an exchange. But grounding the F-35 fleet has cascading implications that go far beyond the aircraft themselves. Israeli intelligence services have relied on persistent surveillance over Syria, Lebanon, and parts of Iraq to monitor Iranian weapons transfers, Hezbollah force movements, and other threats. That surveillance depends on aircraft that can penetrate contested airspace with advanced sensors. Without those aircraft operating freely, Israeli intelligence loses real-time situational awareness in critical areas. Israeli deterrence against Hezbollah has rested on the credible threat of devastating airstrikes that can destroy Hezbollah's rocket infrastructure, command facilities, and logistics networks within hours of conflict initiation. Hezbollah commanders understood that any major attack on Israel would trigger an air campaign that would devastate their organization. Without confidence in air superiority, that deterrence evaporates. Hezbollah now knows that Israeli aircraft are grounded or severely restricted, which means the primary threat constraining Hezbollah actions has been neutralized. The same logic applies to Hamas in Gaza, Iranian proxies in Syria, and any other adversary that previously feared Israeli airstrikes. The entire regional security structure was maintained through Israeli ability to project power through airstrikes that adversaries could not prevent. That ability is now in question. Let me give you the numbers on what this means for regional military balance. Hezbollah possesses an estimated 130,000 to 150,000 rockets and missiles of various ranges and capabilities. Israeli air defenses, Iron Dome, David's Sling, Arrow are designed to intercept a portion of those weapons, but they have never been tested against saturation attacks where thousands of projectiles are launched simultaneously. Israeli military planning has always assumed that air superiority would allow preemptive strikes destroying 50 to 70% of Hezbollah's rocket inventory before it could be launched, reducing the number of projectiles that air defenses must intercept to manageable levels. Without air superiority, Israeli defenses face the full 130,000 to 150,000 rocket inventory with no preemptive reduction. The mathematics of that scenario are catastrophic. Even if Iron Dome achieves 90% interception rates, which is optimistic against saturation attacks, 10,000 to 15,000 rockets reach targets across Israel. Israeli civilian infrastructure, military bases, ports, airports, and power generation facilities are not hardened against this volume of attack. The economic damage would be measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. The casualties would be measured in thousands or tens of thousands depending on civilian shelter effectiveness. This is not speculative analysis. This is arithmetic based on known inventories and demonstrated capabilities. The Russian deployment to Iran has created a scenario where Israeli deterrence fails, Israeli preemptive options are neutralized, and Israeli defense systems face threats exceeding their design parameters. And this scenario emerged in 48 hours through a deployment operation that Israel could observe but not prevent. Section 3. The historical pattern of air power vulnerability. Let me take you back through history to understand what we are witnessing, because this is not a new pattern. This is the oldest pattern in military history. Technological advantage creating temporary dominance that eventually encounters countermeasures that neutralize the advantage. The British Royal Air Force achieved air superiority over Nazi Germany through a combination of radar technology, Spitfire fighters, and tactical innovations during the Battle of Britain in 1940. That air superiority seemed decisive and permanent. British strategic planners assumed air power had fundamentally changed warfare in ways that made traditional ground combat obsolete, or Then, Germany developed jet fighters, V-2 ballistic missiles, and advanced air defense systems that challenged British air superiority. By 1944, British bombing campaigns were suffering unsustainable losses to German defenses. The technological advantage had eroded in 4 years. American air power achieved total dominance during the 1991 Gulf War. The U.S. Air Force destroyed Iraqi air defenses, suppressed Iraqi air forces, and operated freely over Iraqi territory throughout the conflict. American military planners concluded that air superiority could be assumed in any future conflict against regional adversaries. Then, adversaries developed lessons learned from Iraq and invested in advanced air defense systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and asymmetric tactics. By the time America fought in Syria, Russian supply deployed S-300 and S-400 air defense systems created zones where American aircraft could not operate without unacceptable losses. The pattern is consistent. Air superiority is temporary, adversaries adapt. And the forces that become dependent on air superiority find themselves strategically vulnerable when that superiority erodes. Israel is experiencing this pattern now. For 57 years, Israeli air superiority has seemed permanent because adversaries lacked the technological sophistication or economic resources to challenge it effectively. Israeli military planners built an entire national security strategy around an assumption that air superiority would always be available. That assumption just failed. Russia has not developed a new technology to challenge Israeli air superiority. Hypersonic missiles have existed for years. What Russia has done is deploy those existing capabilities to a position where they neutralize Israeli advantages, and they have done so in partnership with a regional adversary that Israel cannot attack without triggering escalation Israel cannot manage. This is the genius of asymmetric warfare. You do not need to match your adversary's capabilities across all domains. You only need to position your capabilities where they create vulnerabilities that your adversary cannot address through their existing advantages. Israel has superior air forces, better training, more advanced technology, and overwhelming qualitative superiority in nearly every measure of military capability. None of that matters when the fundamental precondition for employing those capabilities, the ability to take off from air bases without being destroyed on the ground, has been eliminated. Let me give you the historical analogy that Israeli military historians are certainly discussing right now. France in 1940 had the largest army in Western Europe, better tanks than Germany in many respects, and defensive fortifications along the Maginot Line that were considered impregnable. French military planning assumed that any German attack would follow predictable invasion routes that French defenses were designed to counter. Germany bypassed the Maginot Line by attacking through the Ardennes forest, which French planners had dismissed as impassable for mechanized forces. German tanks moved through terrain that was supposedly impossible to cross, emerged behind French defensive positions, and defeated the French army in 6 weeks despite French material advantages. The lesson was not that German tanks were superior, French tanks were often better. The lesson was that positional advantage and operational surprise can overcome material superiority when the defender's entire strategy assumes the attacker will fight according to the defender's preferred model. Israel has spent 57 years preparing to fight wars based on air superiority. Russia and Iran just position forces that make air superiority impossible to achieve. And Israel has no plan B because the entire strategic culture has been built around an assumption that air superiority is a given. Section 4, the American response dilemma. Here is what you need to understand about America's position in this crisis. The United States provides Israel with approximately $3.8 billion in military aid annually, nearly all of which is spent on American-manufactured weapon systems. This aid has maintained Israeli military superiority for decades and represents America's primary mechanism for influencing Israeli policy and ensuring regional stability that serves American interests. That entire investment just lost most of its strategic value in 48 hours. American F-35s face the same vulnerabilities as Israeli F-35s. American air bases in the region, Al Udeid in Qatar, Al Dhafra in the UAE, several facilities in Iraq are all within Kinjal range from Isfahan. The hypersonic threat is not specific to Israel. It applies to all American regional force projection. The United States has 3 potential responses to this deployment. First, America could demand Russian withdrawal and threaten consequences if Russia refuses. Second, America could deploy countermeasures, including additional air defense systems, forward-positioned hypersonic weapons, or increased naval presence. Third, America could accept the new strategic reality and adjust its regional posture accordingly. Let me walk through each option and explain why none of them solve the fundamental problem. Demanding Russian withdrawal requires credible threats to back up the demand. What threats can America make that Russia finds credible? Economic sanctions are already near maximum levels after Ukraine. Military strikes on Russian forces in Iran trigger direct US-Russia conflict that could escalate to nuclear exchange. Diplomatic isolation has been attempted for 2 years and has failed to change Russian behavior. Russia knows that America is not going to start World War III over bomber deployments in Iran. And without credible escalation threats, American demands are noise that Russia can safely ignore. So, deploying countermeasures sounds logical until you examine the operational reality. American air defense systems cannot reliably intercept hypersonic missiles. The physics of the problem remain unsolved despite billions in research funding. Forward positioning American hypersonic weapons would require host country approval, and most regional partners are now questioning whether hosting American weapons makes them safer or creates additional targets. Increased naval presence means moving carrier strike groups into the Persian Gulf, where they become vulnerable to the same asymmetric threats: anti-ship missiles, mines, swarm attacks that we analyzed in the Strait of Hormuz scenario. American carriers in confined waters are extraordinarily vulnerable assets whose loss would represent catastrophic political and military defeat. Which leaves the third option, accepting the new strategic reality. This is where American policy faces impossible choices similar to the scenarios we examined with the Strait of Hormuz. America can attempt to maintain its position through increasingly risky military postures that could trigger catastrophic escalation. Or America can accept that its regional dominance is eroding and begin managed retreat from commitments it can no longer fulfill. Neither option is acceptable to American political leadership, which is why you are seeing contradictory statements about ironclad commitment to Israeli security combined with quiet diplomatic outreach to Iran about potential negotiations. The contradiction reveals the policy incoherence. America is simultaneously signaling that it will defend Israel against any threat while privately acknowledging that the threats Israel now faces exceed American capabilities to neutralize without triggering broader war. Let me give you the numbers on what American military intervention would require if this situation escalates to actual conflict. Destroying the Russian bomber deployment at Isfahan would require penetrating Iranian airspace with strike aircraft, suppressing or destroying Iranian air defenses along the approach routes, executing precision strikes on hardened aircraft shelters, while Russian aircraft are grounded, and egressing Iranian airspace before Iranian missile responses can target American aircraft. The operation is technically possible. The U.S. Air Force has the capabilities to execute this mission profile. But executing it means killing Russian military personnel, destroying Russian strategic assets, and creating a direct military confrontation between nuclear-armed powers. Every American war game that has modeled US-Russia direct conflict has concluded with scenarios ranging from conventional stalemate to nuclear escalation. There is no path to American victory that does not carry existential risks. And this is over bomber deployments in Iran. The stakes do not justify the risks when examined rationally. But rational analysis often fails when political leaders face demands to demonstrate strength and credibility. The American position is further complicated by the fact that regional partners are watching how America responds to this challenge. If America cannot or will not neutralize the Russian deployment, what does that say about American security guarantees? Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and other American partners are drawing conclusions about American reliability based on what they observe in the next 30 to 60 days. If America accepts Russian deployments without effective response, those partners will accelerate their diplomatic outreach to Iran, Russia, and China as insurance against American withdrawal. This is the cascading effect of strategic setbacks. Each failure to respond effectively creates additional failures as allies lose confidence and adversaries gain confidence. And the process accelerates because the structural weaknesses that caused the initial failure remain unaddressed while adversaries exploit them more aggressively.